For early access to more videos like this, plus exclusive content, community discussions, and more, become a patron at patreon.com/BrucePoinsett. Welcome back to the Blacktastic Adventure. I'm your host, Bruce Poinsett, and on today's episode, I speak with Bill Deiz. Bill is now retired after a nearly 40-year career as a radio and television news reporter and news anchorman in Portland, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. CNN features Bill in the recent documentary series, The Radical Story of Patty Hearst, since Bill and his team broadcast live one of the most dramatic events in the history of Los Angeles, the 2.5-hour gun battle between the Symbionese Liberation Army, kidnappers of Patty Hearst, and the Los Angeles police. Their television signal was shared around the world and helped usher in a new age of electronic news gathering. I'm really excited to share this conversation with you because Bill, he just has honestly several lifetimes worth of stories working in the newsroom, also just being in Portland in the days in the 40s and 50s and going to school at Boise back before it was Boise Elliott and then Boise Elliott Humboldt, or performing at the Cotton Club, and being part of one of the groups that was founded by the mayor of Portland, Paul Knowles. And yeah, he's just the man's lived several lifetimes, not just in news media, but as an actor, again, as a musician, as an entrepreneur. So without further ado, I just want to share this interview with you and let you just enjoy Bill's stories like I did. So check it out. Good morning, Bill. Thank you for being on the Blacktastic Adventure today.
Good morning. It's my pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So we're just going to jump into it. Oregon obviously is the only state that, had laws literally banning Black people from settling here. It's kind of full of these stories basically of making something, or like making a way where there was no way, right?
Right.
And I think, one of the reasons I was really interested in, interviewing you for the series is just that I feel like your story is filled with, making a way.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to kind of start off around the beginning. You moved to Oregon when you were 4 years old, correct? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and let me give you a little background. My mother, Mercedes, married the first time to a gentleman named Billy Owens, and he was a writer in New York City, in Harlem, and part of the Harlem Renaissance with writers like Ralph Ellison, who wrote The Invisible Man, and people like that. They all hung out together. And my mom worked at the Federal Theater, which was a Work Products Administration WPA project that Roosevelt did during the Depression to give artists a chance to keep working while there was a depression on. So she worked with people like Will Geer and Orson Welles and stuff there. She was kind of behind the scenes there, but Orson thought enough of her to want to take her out to Hollywood with him to teach her lighting. So she was a woman of mixed race. Her mother was from Czechoslovakia. So she was a blonde girl from Czechoslovakia who moved to New York via Ellis Island. And her father was a Cuban, Afro-Cuban, who moved to New York via Ellis Island. His name was Lopez. Her name was Kuzma. And he was the elevator operator in her building in New York City, in Manhattan. And they hit it off. And they ended up marrying, and they had 10 kids. And my mom was the oldest of 10 kids. So she helped raise her brothers and sisters. And so when she and my birth father married, we lived in Harlem. And he turned out to be an alcoholic, which we probably didn't know. I don't think she knew that. And he got pretty physically abusive. And at one point, I actually woke up from bed and climbed out of my little bed and watched him beating her within an inch of her life. It was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. Wow. And I started crying, and they stopped, they stopped them in their tracks. And shortly after that, Mom, without me knowing it, had called her brother. One of her brothers had moved to this far off place that nobody had ever heard of in Harlem called Portland, Oregon.
Hmm.
And her brother, Paul, had made his way here. And so she called him up, and Paul said, "Get the hell out of there. Get out of that terrible situation you and little Billy," I was little Billy, "you and Billy are in, and come out and stay with us for a while out here in Portland." So she scraped together some money. She was working at that time in an advertising agency, and some of the folks there found out about her difficulty and helped her get enough for train tickets. And we, without my birth father's knowledge, just jumped on a train and headed west. And we had no money. We just had enough money for the train ticket. We didn't have money for meals. And some of the porters on that train discovered our dilemma. I guess Mom looked worried, you know, this single mom with this little kid. And they took pity on her and they said, "Look, don't worry about food. We'll feed you all the way out to Portland." So they took care of us. They took us under their wing. I'll never forget it. And they kept us well fed for the entire trip. Well, actually, we had to change trains in Chicago. And then in the Chicago train, that was the long stretch from Chicago to Portland. And so we got out to Portland. We left New York City. It was cold and icy and freezing and snowing. And it was bitterly cold in Chicago. I remember that, even in the train station, area when we got there. And then we got to Portland, and it was about this time of year in 1948 that we arrived in Portland, in about February of 48. And I'll never forget, it was sunny. You know how we get some February days that are sunny? It was just nice and sunny and warm. And so Uncle Paul picked us up. He had a car, and he drove us from the train station across the Broadway Bridge to his house. He actually had a house with his wife, Aunt Odelia, and we moved in with them on North Benton, just off of North Broadway, you know, right near where the Coliseum is now, where that Beacon Storage is still there. That Beacon Storage building is still there. Well, that was our block. That was Benton Street, where the school district headquarters is now on that street. That was our neighborhood. It was all houses then in 1948. So we moved there. It was on the edge of what's called Albina. You know, it wasn't right in the heart of Albina. So it actually was a fairly mixed neighborhood. There were blacks and whites together. And that was the earliest memory of Portland, was playing with the kids on that street, blacks and whites, without any thought about racial problems. As I was growing up, Mom got more and more active. She joined the Urban League and the NAACP shortly after we got to Portland in 1948. We got out here in February. Memorial Day was the Vanport flood, you know, the great, horrible Vanport flood with so many people wiped out. So Mom jumps in and gets involved with the Red Cross and helps with the, you know, relief efforts and all that stuff, helping people. And she's getting to know more and more people in Portland. And so she finally gets a job at, I think it was the IRS, and Carl Deiz was working there, and that's where they met. And then he went to Bonneville Power Administration after that. But Mom met Carl, and they started dating. And we liked the fact that he had a car, and he always was on time. He was one of these people who was a stickler. If he said he was going to do something, he did it. There was no excuse. You know, it was like, if I give you my word, if I'm going to be there, don't worry about it. You're taken care of. So having that bad experience in New York, also Carl Deiz didn't drink at all. And so having the bad alcoholic experience in New York, and then having this, he also had been a Tuskegee Airman in World War II. And his brother Bob who was older, had also been a Tuskegee Airman. He got Carl to join Tuskegee Airmen, and as an officer, they both joined as officers. He said, "You have a better chance of flying if you're an officer." So they both went to officers candidate school first, and this is during World War II, you know, at the height of the war. Bob ends up flying in Italy and fighting the Luftwaffe and downing German planes over Italy in dogfights. And he comes back decorated, He comes back, has a career in the Air Force as a major, ends up, and Carl, ended up, and anyway, Carl and Merce end up eloping. And part of the deal is, are you going to adopt little Billy? And so fortunately he said yes. And so he adopted me. That's how I got the name Deiz. My first name was Owens, Billy Owens. And then I became Billy Deiz. And he and Mom remarried in Portland with a big ceremony after they eloped. And then they got their own place. And you know where Boyce School is,
right.
Boyce Elliott. Well, we were right across the playground. We rented this little this dumpy little place. It's still there. You know, I probably 1 bedroom, you know, 1 bath. Pipes froze that winter, you know, flooded, you know, the whole bit. But my first year in grade school, I did half a year in first grade at Boyce. It wasn't Boyce Elliott, it was Boyce. It was just Boyce School there. And I only had to walk across the playground to get to my class. We were right literally off the playground, our little house. So I had no danger getting to school. So they were both working, both Mom and Dad were working, so I could just go to school. They finally relocated out to where Columbia Villa is. There's a place that was called University Homes. It was World War II housing that they built for returning veterans. And so we were in University Homes for a while, and they transferred me to Portsmouth School. So I ended up in Portsmouth School for the second half of my first grade. And that helped establish us there in North Portland. And then they found a house being built on Portsmouth Avenue. At a time, Black people just weren't buying houses out of Albina. It wasn't happening. But they scraped together the money for the down payment, and they bought the house because they were both working. So we ended up, it was a brand new house. So it was a small house, you know, it's still there. It was a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house on North Portsmouth Avenue. And I went to Portsmouth School because I could walk right up the block, right up Portsmouth to the school. And it was a white neighborhood. So what we didn't know, I mean, I didn't know anything. It was like somehow this was against the segregation of Portland that we would move to this white neighborhood. So this one neighbor group across the street, this one family, started a petition that we should not be able to allowed to be able to live there, you know, even though we were already in the house.
And like,
so
when you say a petition for you mean like for your family specifically?
Oh, it was targeting, who are these people? You know, who are these Black people coming into our neighborhood? So that was my first inkling, although they shielded me from that, you know, from the knowledge of the petition, because what was happening as the petition was being developed and starting to be circulated, I was walking to school every morning with all the kids in the block. It was a whole group of families with little kids in that neighborhood because it was affordable, and we would all walk to school together. And the neighbor behind us, we'd walk to school together. He's still a friend to this day. Norman Parks was our neighbor behind. And I was in all of the homes playing with all the kids, you know, after school. And the moms were home. In those days, moms didn't work so much. You know, they stayed home with the family, and the dads worked. This is the 50s. My mom and dad were the exception. They both had jobs, you know, but most of the women there got to know me. And they tore up the petition. They said to their husbands, "This is crazy. There's nothing wrong with this family. Leave them alone." So the one neighbor that was trying to start the petition, they stayed fairly hostile the whole time we were there. But everybody else on that block became neighbors. So my experience in segregated Portland was first at Uncle Paul's house, where it was a mixed neighborhood and it wasn't a big deal. And now I'm in this basically white neighborhood, but I'm really near Columbia Villa. We're like 2 blocks away from Columbia Villa. So I got a lot of Black friends too, who were living in Columbia Villa, and we were all playing together, and we're all, you know, there was this little field between my house and Columbia Villa, and we all played football there and baseball, and, you know, just hung out and stuff. And so our little group, were just a mixed group. It was kind of like Our Gang. Did you ever see that movie, Our Gang? It was little kids Oh, it was way back from the 40s, but it was basically a mixed group of kids growing up together, playing together, having their clubhouse and stuff. Blacks, a couple of black kids and many white kids, but it was kind of like Portland.
Mm.
Anyway, we grew up like that, and the kids on my block were my brothers. We never had animosity. There wasn't any racial animosity on that block. And so when I grew up, going through Portsmouth School, I was one of the smarter kids, quote unquote. And so the teachers always encouraged me. They never treated me like a inferior student. They always just treated me like everybody else. And it was more of a, encouragement. So I had, a really good 8 years at Portsmouth. And then I got to Roosevelt High School, and there was some racial conflict there, as you start getting older. And I did have some problems in middle school. I will say that there were times when the bullies would come after me. Shall I tell you my horrible story about grade school, about race? Because we all have racial stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we all have racial incidents that occurred to us. Well, I got a paper route in the 8th grade and delivering the Oregonian newspaper, and I was able to finesse it so that I got the route in my own neighborhood, so that my house was the middle of the route. So if it was a bad stormy day, I could stop at my house, drink hot chocolate or something and go back and finish the rest of my route. Well, one day I was in the 8th grade and I was a little kid, with glasses. Went contact lenses later, but in those days I had glasses. So like now that I'm old, I have glasses again. I don't care anymore. Anyway, I'm going to get my papers at the place up near Roosevelt High School, at the paper place where they dropped off all the newspapers, and we rolled them up and put them in our bag, and rode our bicycles and threw the papers on the porch. And so I'm walking my bike across this railroad overpass, getting ready to go to the news place. Pickup was right there on the edge of the railroad overpass on North Lombard, not far from Roosevelt High School, kind of where the Fred Meyer is today, if you know where that is. And so I'm there. Fred Meyer wasn't there yet. And so I'm there getting ready to get my paper, and I'm getting off my bike. And all of a sudden, these two bullies approach me, and they're teenagers, and I'm in the 8th grade, and they grab me, and they knock my bike over. These two white guys, teenagers, much bigger than me, and they grab me and they hold me over the railing, over the railroad tracks, which are like, 50 feet down below.
Wow.
And they dangle me over the railroad tracks. And I guess they expected me to squeal or squirm or cry or, show terror. But I just pissed me off. I mean, I had been minding my own business. I wasn't doing anything to anybody. And so I just got angry, and I thought, I'm not going to give these guys the pleasure of being scared or doing anything. I just got very angry inside, and I found myself gripping the clothing of one of the guys that was holding me right near his belt level. And I figured, okay, if they drop me, I'm taking one of them with me, and I'm going to land on him. I had this all figured out. I was like, I didn't know, but I said, if these people are stupid enough to drop me, first, I'm not going to give them any satisfaction. I'm not going to let them see me cry or squirm or anything. And I just glared at them, didn't say a word, got my grip tightened around the one guy, and was waiting to see if they were going to actually, let me go over the railing. And when I didn't squirm and cry and anything and just glared at him, they finally just shrugged I remember they shrugged their shoulders, they put me down, and they just walked away. So, they were trying to provoke a reaction, and I didn't give it to them. Well, one of the things it did for me was years later, it was one of the reasons I joined the Marine Corps, because I figured I'm going to learn how to handle myself. And then I actually had some good friends at Roosevelt. I actually made friends in high school with some of the toughest people in North Portland, both black and white. And they had my back. And so I went through the entire high school career at Roosevelt High School, which is a pretty rough place. And I never got in a fist fight. But I also played football, and I also wrestled for 4 years. So I had, you know, some respect from some of the athletes there, even though I was kind of a little guy. But, you know, just the fact that I was always out there doing stuff seemed to have a positive effect on them. And nobody messed with me the whole time I was in Roosevelt. I mean, there were incidents where people would call you names and stuff. You know, I mean, it was, you know, growing up. But the stuff that I had in the middle school, that was where my last fist fight had been, was middle school, where, you know, bullies would pick on you. You know, there's always the bullies, the big guys picking on the little guys, you know, but what I learned was how to make friends with the guys who weren't bullies, who the bullies were afraid of. You know, I mean, there's some pretty bad dudes out in North Portland, and you didn't mess with them. And so they were my friends. In fact, one of them lived on my block. One of the guys who got a rep was a white kid named Billy Hutchison, who was kind of like a white Muhammad Ali. Every time I see Muhammad Ali, I think of Billy Hutchison. Billy Hutchison was bad. You did not. In fact, the reason that Billy and I got along so well was when we were in grade school, I fought him one time, and he was younger than me, and he beat the crap out of me. Like I said, he's a young Muhammad Ali. He was a white Muhammad Ali, and Billy always looked up to me for some reason, and he always became one of my protectors. You know, so I never had any trouble in high school. In fact, later on in life, Billy was in a rock and roll band as rhythm guitar player, a white rock and roll band based in St. Helens, Oregon. And he came to me one day and he said, "Bill, we just fired our guitar player, and we know that you play guitar. If you could learn the guitar part to Louie Louie," you know, did you know what Louie Louie, you know Louie?
Yeah,
everybody knows Louie. Yeah, the original Louie, I mean, Kingsmen Louie Louie. If you can learn the Kingsmen Louie Louie guitar part, you can get in the band. And I didn't even know if I wanted to be in the band, but he was so insistent. So I finally went with him and auditioned. I learned it off the record, learned the guitar part. And then I also did the Paul Revere and the Raiders version, and I combined the two. And I blew them away in the audition because I played a combination thing, and they were like, "Whoa," you know. So I got in this rock and roll band with Billy for about a year, and we played all over the area, and we never had any trouble. And gradually I became the lead singer in the band called the Roadrunners. And I'm telling this because it leads into another thing. During the time I was with the band, I was in college at Portland State, and they decided they got a gig in Portland. So they brought all the gear, because we'd been rehearsing in St. Helens. They brought all the gear to my parents' basement in North Portland for a week, you know, until we did the gig. And we had a rehearsal, and then they left the gear there. Well, I'm going to Portland State now, and I've been playing in other bands through the years and stuff. And I start handpicking people from Portland State who I know can really play. And I say, "Why don't you come out to my house in North Portland and we'll have a jam session?" So I bring out Henry Moore, Ivory Hudson, Wayne Purnell, our drummer, Ron Edge, and Ray Tuscan. I get all these different people together. And what ends up happening is that this becomes the nucleus of one of the biggest bands to ever hit LA. Because what happens that magical day in North Portland is we start playing together, and we are already better than the band I was with. You know, our first jam session, and we're starting to play things like James Brown and Ike and Tina Turner, and the soul thing is just starting to happen. This is the 60s, and we're a white and black group, but we're like, everybody's into soul music. And so we end up, Henry and Ivory and I are in choir together at Portland State. They have a spring show that year. They bring my band in, you know, our first public performance at the spring show. We didn't even have a name yet. And I get everybody together. Ivory does James Brown. He does Please, Please, Please. You know that song by James Brown? Yeah. Baby, Please Don't Go. He gets on his knees. And see, this is white Portland at Portland State. This is before James Brown had gone mainstream before the crossover. So only black people knew about James Brown. So he does this thing, Ivory does this thing, the girls just go crazy. It's like the Beatles. I mean, the girls start screaming and everything. And then he does Hitchhike by Marvin Gaye, you know, and anyway, as people leave, you know, they're supposed to leave, they won't leave. They rush the stage and they keep us playing. And we only know 5 songs, you know, because but they keep us, you know, so we start playing the same songs over and over again. And we realize that we actually must have something. So we end up forming a group there. Paul Knowles, I've been on his program, you know, they've done a couple of things with Paul recently, and we were one of his discoveries. We played the Cotton Club when we were in our teens. We recorded in our teens. And then from this nucleus, we became first the Harlequins, Ivory Hudson and the Harlequins. And then we went to LA the summer of 1965 and became the Seven Souls. And that's another story, which is probably going to take another hour to tell. But we ended up with Henry Mancini's publisher as our manager, with Ike and Tina Turner's record label as our record label, and with the Righteous Brothers agent, Jerry Parenchio, who became a billionaire, as our agent. And our first summer in LA, and we're playing at the Club Californian, and we're like bringing the house down. And we begun building a real reputation there. And then what happens to me, thanks to Lyndon Johnson, we don't know that the summer of '65, the Vietnam War is about to heat up to this huge scale. Thanks to LBJ took over for John F. Kennedy. Kennedy was going to pull us out of Vietnam. JFK instead builds up the war in Vietnam. And so I end up joining the Marine Corps Reserve so that I don't have to go with the Army. Nobody wanted to go with the Army. I figured if I'm going to go over there, at least I want to learn how to fight. You know? Mm-hmm. And so that summer, I end up joining the Marine Corps Reserve, and I start training with them on weekends. And then gradually, I have to leave the band. We have this really great star thing where we're the band that plays at the Beverly Hills Hotel when Bobby Hatfield of the Righteous Brothers gets married, his wedding reception. Everybody's there. Dick Clark, everybody from Hollywood's there. And we're actually on video. There's a video of people dancing to our music from that wedding reception that was played. Alex Hart. Do you know Alex Hart? I think his dad was in Paul Revere and the Raiders or something like that. Anyway, there was a connection. And so, you know, we end up really building. I end up going into the Marine Corps for training in 1966 and, you know, become a combat infantry rifleman over 6 months, hand-to-hand combat. You know, I can kill you with one hand. No, not a 77. I'm a peace builder. I don't do that stuff anymore. But it was good training, because what ended up happening in 65, 66, I went into boot camp. They were starting to realize that they needed leaders of color. It wasn't just discriminatory. They were bringing people of talent. You know, if you showed anything, you became one of the leaders. And so I was the first squad leader, and I kept that all the way through boot camp. And I ended up, it was an honor to earn your PFC stripe out of boot camp, which I did, and basically kept my team, you know, together. And you learn a lot about working with teams and, you know, worrying about other people, not just yourself, you know, so that your missions are successful, so that you can bring people in and bring them out. And so that was good training, and it gave me some discipline, so that when I went back, when I got out of my training as a reservist, I thought maybe I could get back with the band. But after 6 months out of the band, they had replaced me. And so I went back home to Portland and finished up at Portland State. And so as I'm getting ready to graduate in Portland State, I finish all my credits early. I finish in the winter term. You know, official graduation's in June, but I've now got enough credits that I finish up all my stuff in winter term, just as the things are opening up at the news stations. So I go interview at Channel 6 and I go interview at Channel 8. And this is a great story. Channel 6 says, yeah, Bill, we like who you are. You know, they took my background into account and all the stuff I'd done. And they said, here's what we'll do. We'll make you a paid intern in our newsroom for 6 months and really teach you how to be a reporter and then put you on the air. You know, now this is a guy who's been to LA, man. I've helped conquer LA, right? And you're telling me you're going to make me an intern for 6 months? I mean, that's nice if that's all I can get. So I go over to Channel 8, and Channel 8 looks at me and they said, man, with your background, we think we can put you on the air next week on KHW radio. We own the radio as well as the TV. What we'll do is we'll start you in radio and teach you the basics on the job of how to be a reporter. And then when it's the right time, we'll put you on TV. And I said, so over here it's 6 months, maybe. And over here it's Channel 8 saying, next week you'll be doing a newscast. You know, what am I going to do? I'm going to go on the air. So the miracle for me was they paired me with a guy who was one of the senior reporters on staff. His name was Ron Holden. And now I'd come out of Marine Corps boot camp and all that stuff. Ron Holden gave me a radio broadcast boot camp. He taught me everything without any reservation, without any hesitation, without any black, white, pink, just, you know, because they had told him at KGW, we don't want to hire Bill as a black reporter. We want to hire him as a reporter, period. So Ron, God bless him, basically made it me his project. So I followed him around. We went on stories, you know. Pretty soon I was doing newscasts. I learned how to get all the stuff gathered and, you know, do everything. Pretty soon they give me a car. I got my own little car, little 62 KGW car that I'm driving around. I got my little tape recorder. I'm going out and covering things. The one person who didn't like me there was the news director, Jim, whatever his name was. See, I got a blank on it. But anyway, he didn't like me because I think they forced me on him. You know, I don't think he had, you know, upper management decided Deiz is going to get in there. And, you know, and so he was always kind of cool to me. But I learned out he was also very conservative, which is odd in news because a lot of people in news are fairly liberal. But well, this is before Fox. Forget that, you know, anyway, this is this is when most people were pretty liberal who worked.
Yeah, because we're still talking about the late 60s, right?
Yeah, 68. And so this guy doesn't, not only is he cool to me, one day he comes in, I just got off the air. I'll never forget this. He says, that damn Bobby Kennedy is downstairs being interviewed for television for KGW. I can't stand that Bob Kennedy. Can't stand his ass. I'm going to assign you. You stick to him like glue today, and you give me reports on his visit to Portland as he runs for president. And I'm thinking, freaking Bobby Kennedy? He's assigning me to Bobby Kennedy? I mean, God, everybody, you know, so I spent the day covering Bobby Kennedy, feeding reports of his speeches at Portland State. There's pictures of the big mob at Portland State. I literally, after he spoke at Portland State, I literally walked out side by side with him into the crowd. And the crowd was like Beatles fan. It was like Beatlemania. I mean, they just embraced him. They wouldn't let him through. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, man, this politics ain't such a bad thing. Here's the crazy story. And this is really crazy about success. By now, I've read Alex Haley's Think and Grow Rich. I mean, the book that he told me. And I'm thinking, man, I can do this stuff. And now I've done Sanford & Son, the #2 show in America, right? That's where I started. My first paid job in LA is the #2 show in America on TV. And I'm thinking, hey, I'm going to be a star. Hey, this is cool. So I'm running around trying to get parts without an agent, which you can't do. And all of a sudden, Channel 2, that had the hiring freeze, calls me in for an interview out of the clear blue. Well, here's what happens. And this is the honest to God truth. You know how they say, if you play hard to get, things happen?
Mm-hmm. I
I wasn't playing hard to get. I had just done Sanford and Son. My mind was thinking, I'm going to be a star. And so, and I'd seen Red Fox, you know, I've seen those guys, you know, I mean, I was with them and I'm thinking, hey, I can do this. And so they called me for the interview and I say, well, I don't know if I'm so interested in news anymore. I think I'm going to have my own show. And so I tell this to the news director and he looks at me and he says, huh? And so he kicks me upstairs to the next level, to the executive producer. And I say, yeah, I just did this Sanford and Son. And, you know, I really think I have a lot to offer LA. And, you know, I'm sounding like Muhammad Ali. I don't even realize it, but that's what I'm sounding like. And so he kicks me upstairs to the general manager. And I say to the general manager, I'm not so sure about this news thing anymore. I think I want to be, you know, I'm really going to have my own show someday. Maybe you guys can help me get there. You know, and I've been in music and I've done all this stuff, you know, and so they keep calling me back, you know, and finally, about a month later, the phone rings and the news department calls me and they say, are you really sure you don't want news? Because we just had an opening and we're willing to bring you in on a trial basis. If you're willing to come in for a 3-week trial, we'll pay you. Well, by that time, I hadn't done another acting job. I hadn't done another, you know, anything, just interviews. And I'm desperate. And the one thing the Think and Grow Rich book said, if you're ever offered a chance to either work for free or do a trial, do it. You know, show what you can do. So I said, okay, I'll come in for the trial. You know, I was smart enough not to say that I didn't want to do news anymore. By then I realized I needed a job, whatever it was. So I said, sure, I'll come in. First 2 days, no assignment. And I'm starting to get desperate, right? I'm thinking, how on a 3-week trial, if I can't show what I can do, how can I get hired here? You know, the first 2 days, Monday and Tuesday, no assignment. Wednesday, the assignment editor calls me and he says, I think I have something for you. And this is the miracle. This lighthouse on the coast is being retired and automated. And the lighthouse keeper who's been there, you know, for years, turning on the light and all that stuff, he's retiring and they're going to automate the lighthouse. And this is his last day on the job. So go profile him. And they send me with one of the best photographers with all these great waves and, you know, the sea and seagulls. And I mean, all this stuff. And I write one of the best scripts I ever wrote. And the first story I do in LA, they nationally syndicate to all the CBS stations nationwide. It's so good that they syndicate it. And the next day, Thursday, I don't have an assignment and I'm sitting at my desk and all hell breaks loose. A guy steals a helicopter and the police helicopter chases him through the San Fernando Valley, air to air. And I'm the only one in the newsroom because I haven't had an assignment yet. And they grab me and said, Deiz, get on this story. It becomes the lead story that night. So the first story I do is syndicated nationally. The second story, I haven't even been on the set. You know, there's a news set I haven't even been on the set yet. And they say, Bill, you're going to sit up there next to Jerry Dunphy and you're going to do the story on the big news tonight at 6. And you're our lead story. So don't mess it up. You know? Well, by now I'm seasoned. I've done radio and TV in Portland. You know, I'm seasoned. I know what I'm doing. So I get the story, I deliver the story, I put it on the air, and it's done well. And the next day, I can't even remember what the story was, Friday, I get another major story where I'm on the set again. So I've had a syndicated story, the lead story, and now I've had another major story where I'm on the set with Jerry Dunphy. And that's my first week on this trial job, right? You know, and I've had 3 stories. And I get off the air that Friday and the news director calls me in his office. He says, Bill, the trial's over. We want you on staff. Bam! Just like that. I'm on the big news. I'm on the staff. I'm on KCBS Channel 2 News. And so I'm a reporter. So I go out and I do my stuff. And so we were doing all these little stories, you know. I covered Elizabeth Taylor coming home. I covered the zoo, you know, all kinds of things, you know, with this new camera. And about this time, Patty Hearst story starts to develop up in San Francisco. And they, you know, we're following it. And we got a couple of reporters in LA
just
who are doing
quickly. Could you just kind of like quickly just summarize the Patty Hearst story for, you know, our younger viewers, I guess?
Oh yeah, Patty Hearst was a heiress to a newspaper fortune. Her dad owned the major San Francisco newspaper, the Hearst papers, and Patty was their daughter, and she was a college student at California, Berkeley. And there was this new organization that was developing. It was a very time of lots of anti-war stuff, a lot of peace stuff. You know, the Vietnam War was going on. The Bay Area was ripe with all these different groups. There were Black Power groups like the Black Panthers that were coming along, and this little side group called the Symbionese Liberation Army, formed by a Black ex-con named Donald DeFries, who called himself Sing-Q. And Sing-Q's, their first act had actually been a violent act, and that had turned me off. They had mistakenly killed the Black superintendent of Oakland schools because they thought he had done something which he hadn't done. So they blamed him for doing something that he actually hadn't done, and they killed him for it. And so I'm thinking any Black group that would take the life of somebody who was doing some good in Oakland is off my radar, isn't part of my group. So I was angry, already at the Symbionese Liberation Army for killing Marcus Foster, the Black Oakland school superintendent. And it turns out, needlessly, he hadn't done what they thought he'd done, which was just completely bogus. So anyway, they decide to kidnap Patty Hearst and snatch her out of her apartment in Berkeley and hold her for some kind of ransom. And so they do. They actually figure out where she lives. She's just a student like anybody else. And they, one night, raid her apartment and kidnap her and throw her in a closet in their place and basically treat her really roughly. And as they start organizing what they are going to do with her, and they're going to get some sort of ransom out of her, and they talk back and forth, and they decide that they want their ransom is going to be to do a food project that Hearst is going to come up with millions of dollars to feed the hungry in the Bay Area. So they come up with this abortive food project that runs amok. It doesn't feed the people. It goes crazy. And meanwhile, Patty is being indoctrinated in their anti-establishment philosophy. They're basically against all white people in America, even though most of the membership of the SLA is white middle class. A lot of white middle class women are following this Sing-Q guy. And he starts issuing tapes saying, the fascist insect, we're going to prey, are preying on the people. We're going to destroy you. We're going to destroy you. You know, we are the people. We're going to rise up and revolt. And what they thought they were going to do is create some sort of a revolt against the establishment. But there were only at most 6 to 8 of them in their group. They weren't even as big as the Panthers, which were huge, you know, they with chapters all over the country.
And the Panthers and the other groups denounced, like, after with the
after they killed Marcus Foster, the Panthers did what I did. They denounced the group. They said it's an ex-con leading them down the wrong path. They were as angry as I was about the killing of the Black Oakland school superintendent, who they've been working with. The Panthers in Oakland have been working with this guy, you know, to make things better. And so, so right off the bat, they denounced that. They also denounced the kidnapping. And so there was a division already, you know. So, Sing-Q was just doing his own thing, but he had a lot of white liberals who were on board with him in the Bay Area. And so they were able to hide out as they kidnapped Patty, and they weren't caught. And so finally, Patty ends up announcing that she's joining them, which shocks everybody. And the next thing you know, they're robbing a bank, and Patty's there with a submachine gun, you know, and she's part of the bank robbing team, and she's on camera. And then they have tapes that they issue with her voice on it saying that she's joined the SLA, and, you know, they're her brothers and sisters, and they're in the struggle and all this stuff. Well, things started getting too hot for them in San Francisco, and they mistakenly, and we all said, St. Q at one point had lived in LA, so he felt he could move to the black area of LA and hide out. Well, if he had gone there himself to Watts as a black man, he could have hidden out. But he took his whole group with him. And they got a house with, and all these white people are seen in Watts with guns. And nobody knows that the Symbionese Liberation Army. They don't know who they are. They just know there's a bunch of white people with guns coming into their neighborhood. So they start telling the police, you know, they start tipping. I mean, these tips start flying like crazy. So finally, the night before I get involved, they raid a store, Mel's Sporting Goods store. They go in for some supplies, and the guard there thinks that they're stealing something, but they really aren't. But he gets the impression that the guy Bill Harris has stolen something out of the store. So he follows them out of the store and confronts him on the street to put back what he thought he stole. And Harris said, man, I didn't steal anything. We paid for everything. Actually, Harris was right. They actually hadn't stolen anything. But the guard starts wrestling with Bill Harris on the street, right there in wherever, Mel's Sporting Goods. Patty Hearst is in the van with a machine gun. And she sees this guard wrestling with her guy from the SLA, and she's never even fired one of these things before. And she starts spraying rounds in their direction. It's the middle of the afternoon, and people are on the street. And she starts firing this thing, and bullets are hitting the sidewalk. They almost hit Bill Harris, who's one of the SLA guys. You know, the guard drops, you know, the guard has gotten one handcuff around Bill Harris. and Harris says, you better get out of here. And the guard runs back in the store. And Harris and the other SLA person jump in the van with Patty Hearst and drive off. And they, you know, and now there's a manhunt. I mean, you know, they announce, and they also steal that when they stole the van from a guy, and they announced that they were the SLA. And they make him ride around with him for a while and stuff. So now the word is out to LAPD that the SLA is in LA. And, you know, San Francisco police do things a certain way. LAPD is one of the most militaristic SWAT, the original SWAT team originated in LA with heavily armed, commando units, right, to go after crime. So they get the SWAT people going. And now so the morning after the Mel's Sporting Goods, now we know they're in LA. I go into the station. I've been going in early these days, and I'm the first one in. And they're getting ready to do a live broadcast from the newsroom, and they grab me to put me in front of the camera, and they say, Bill, we need you to anchor this and toss it to Bob Navarro, who's at one of the sites where they think they might have the SLA. You know, this is like 7:30 in the morning, 8 o'clock in the morning. So we go to I do the anchoring, we toss it to Bob, they hit the house. The SLA has been in the house, but they're not there anymore. They've moved on, but they left some stuff behind. So now the cops know that they got a target. They got a narrower area to look. So I have just done this anchoring, right, in the newsroom, and I got Bob on, and everything went really well. You know, we got the story out. We probably beat everybody in town. I mean, we were one of the only ones over there. And so I'm on the story now. It's like I'm on, you know, my adrenaline's going. So I go to my assignment there and say, okay, I did my bit. Where do you want me next? He says, oh, don't worry, Bill. We got plenty of people on the story already. We're going to assign you to a car show today. I said, what? So what the? I said, I'm on this story, Bob. So for the next hour, I go back to my desk, pacing back and forth. And I go to Bob and I say, Bob, you got to put me on the story. Back to my desk. Bob, you got to put me on the story. Back to my desk. I must have been, when I think about it, I must have looked like Muhammad Ali. Because I mean, it was like Muhammad would do, he would do this kind of stuff too. It's like, get something in his mind and he's just not going to let go, you know. I didn't say I was the greatest though. So I go back and forth. So finally, Bob says, look, my assistant assignment editor there, Jeff Wald, he might have something for you. So I go to talk to Jeff, and Jeff says, yeah, I got a buddy of mine up on Outpost Drive where they think one of the vans was abandoned that the SLA was driving. And the FBI is up there right now going door to door doing canvassing people to see what they've seen. I'm going to have you join the guy. There won't be a camera, but he's got all the police radios in his car. So why don't you go up there? You'll see his car. It's a big white car. You can't miss it. We'll drop you off there. And you hang out with him for a while and just see if you guys pick up anything, you know, in this door-to-door canvas. Well, that got me out of the station. Thank God. That got me, you know, I'm not technically on the story yet because I don't have a camera crew, but I'm out of the station. I'm on the story. About an hour after I get there, we get a radio two-way communication from the station. Bill, call us on a landline. That meant that I had to go to a phone somewhere and call so that our competition wouldn't hear what we were doing over our two-way radio, because we all monitored each other to see what everybody was doing. It was very competitive.
Yeah, and just for framing, because this was like what, between this and Watergate were probably the biggest stories in the U.S. at the time, right?
Absolutely. Actually, Patty Hearst was bigger than Watergate at the time, at that moment in time. In May of 74. This is like May 17th, 1974. And so I get on the landline and they say, Deiz, we got police doing so-and-so, join them, and you meet your crew. So I met up with a film crew, covered a couple of briefings by the police that morning now I'm on the story. Now I got film. We've got runners on motorcycles joining us, taking the film that's shot back to the station for processing, you know, and so that's going on. And now I'm one of the reporters that's really on the story, and I'm on it. I'm covering like 2 or 3 news briefings, you know, as the target gets narrower and narrower, the focus, you know, you could feel it. You could literally that day, it was a big bright sunny LA May day, you know, and you could just feel the tension in the air. And we kept saying, man, I wouldn't want to be the SLA. We knew the LAPD was going to find him. I mean, it was just like we just didn't know when, right? Mm-hmm. So in the afternoon, I get a call. They call me. They say, meet our minicam. You remember I said we had this new technology called the minicam that could do live reporting from wherever. So Bill, we want you to meet the minicam crew at this new house that they're going to hit. And it's going to happen during the 5:30 newscast. We had a 5:30 to 6 newscast, and we had a 6 to 7 newscast. So during the 5:30 newscast, you'll be live, you know, with your minicam crew. And, you know, and so I did a live report as they hit the house. And again, they came up empty, but the SLA had also been in this house. And they knew they were getting close, you know, they were on the run. And so there was another briefing, and we're covering it, you know, I've got my cameraman and sound man, and I've got the microphone, and I'm covering the news briefing in a parking lot, you know, right near where the house had been hit. And all of a sudden, remember I said we had these runners that were running the film back, you know, when the film crew shot? Well, one of the runners came and grabbed me and said, his name was Tony, he said, Bill, we think we got a better location, and you have to go with me right now. So we all jumped in the van. He directed us to 55th and Compton, 55th and Compton, you know, in Watts. And we drive into the intersection and we look to our left, and there are all these police officers lying on the ground, prone, with their weapons pointed down Compton toward 54th. And we're right in their line of fire. And my sound man says, holy shit. And he slams it in reverse, and we back up and we grab all our gear, including the live camera, and we start shooting. And I run around the corner and I peek around the corner, and there's a shot of me in one of the old tapes where I'm peeking around the corner like high noon, you know, about a gunfight. And just as the first shots are fired from the SLA house, which is at 54th and Compton, just a few houses in from Compton on 54th, we're at 55th and Compton. We've got our van and all our cable, because in those days, the camera wasn't even portable, you know, completely portable. It had to be tied to a cable for power. But the cable was on a reel, huge reel. So you could go a whole block with the cable. So we ran the whole length down on this alleyway right beside Compton, you know, that went the same way as Compton, all the way down to 54th. And all these gunshots are going off, and the cops see us and they push us back because that's where the gun battle's going on. So I go up to the house at the corner. There's a little space between that house and the next house. We duck in there, and we can see in the block the back of the SLA house. And there's gunfire coming from both the back of the house and the front of the house. And we can't see it very well, but we can certainly, you know, we're in the middle of this gun battle. And all these cops start arriving from all over the place. And I'm describing it. And what I don't know is that we've gone live now. I'm just during this whole thing, at first we were taping, and then they started taking our live feed. And we have the only camera that's live inside the battle zone. The police have sealed off the area by now, so nobody else can get in. And we have the only real portable live camera because it's an experimental camera. So for the next 2.5 hours, I cover with, and then they bring in Bob Simmons, who's one of my colleague reporters, and the two of us for the next 2.5 hours cover this whole thing. And we think that we're competing against all the other stations. We don't know that the other stations are shut out of the zone. You know, all we know is we can see what we can see, and we see people coming out of the house. We see the cops dealing with them. We see the firing stopping at points, and the announcement come out with your hands up, and then they start firing again. And it just, you know, and it's this 2.5 hour gun battle, one of the longest gun battles in the history of the United States. I mean, you know, there wasn't the Civil War. Well, even the Civil War didn't last that long, 2.5 hours, if you imagine. I mean, they had machine guns, they had automatic weapons, they had all kinds of stuff in there. And they were just firing willy-nilly at anything that was moving. And at one point, Bob sees the police officers at a telephone pole right in front of us. And Bob decides to go up and interview the guy, which was stupid. And so Bob gets up from our crouched down position, because we're crouched down. I mean, bullets are flying. And he grabs the mic from me, and he goes up to interview this cop. And I go follow him. And this is all on camera, because the camera's back here. And the next thing you know, this bullet goes whizzing by our ears. I mean, you could feel the breeze. You heard it go like a buzz, like a zip, you know? And that was the only time we were exposed, you know, literally the whole afternoon. So we all came back to where I had staked out the position, where we were hunkered down, where the bullets had been flying over our heads. You know, they hadn't been low enough to hit us because we were down. And we did the rest of the broadcast, and then we moved around and stuff as we could and to get more pictures. And then as the thing developed, we were actually able to go to toward the front of the house toward the end of the shootout, because at some point the police were pumping so much tear gas into the house. They had gas masks on. The SLA had gas masks on. And so the police were trying to overload the gas mask with gas grenades that were going off. And they also had brought gasoline into the house. I don't know why. I mean, but the SLA had actually brought cans of gasoline into the house too. I guess that was for their van or something or whatever. But you know, the grenade at some point, the tear gas grenade lit, I think, a curtain on fire, and that lit the gasoline on fire, and the whole thing went up in flames. It wasn't a deliberate act on the part of the police. You know, there was some speculation at first that maybe the police had tried to, you know, do some sort of a bomb, but it was just basically they were really trying to get them to come out and surrender, because there were times people came out of the house who weren't part of the SLA. First, some kids came out of the house, and later some adults came out of the house who weren't part of the SLA, where there was a lull in the fighting, and they were safely out. They weren't shot as they left the house. And so what the police really were trying to do was to get the SLA to surrender and come out, but they kept fighting, and they even started fighting even as the house was burning. And they got under the floor. There was a floor. They got underneath the floor to a crawl space underneath the house, and they were firing out of the crawl space. And then when it got too hot, they came out firing. Some of them came out of the back of the house firing. Some of them came out, and the ones who came out of the back of the house firing were killed. And then the other people in the house were burnt alive. You know, I mean, they basically perished in the flames. And we were there capturing the whole thing. And it went on. What ended up happening was, because we had the only live camera inside the zone, our picture was shared by every LA station, and then every Southern California station, then every West Coast station, then all across the country, then all around the world. So that live image went viral, and we thought we were competing against everybody else. We didn't know we had the only image. And so we were really doing the best job we could to tell the story and get as accurate as we could. And so we ended up, the police chief of LA was at a conference out of town, and he clicked on his TV and watched our coverage for 2.5 hours in his hotel room. Other people, you know, were watching it. Patty Hearst and Bill and Emily Harris had escaped to Disneyland, and they were in a motel watching it from Disneyland. They got out of LA before the shootout. And so, you know, I just got the newsroom secretary at the time, Lorraine Hellman, just wrote me. She wrote a book. I'm in it. I haven't read it yet, but she said that they'd never had a response to any story they'd ever done in LA that like what they had, the favorable response they had to our coverage of that. We ended up winning LA Emmy, Golden Mike Awards. Police Protective League gave me a standing ovation and an award. The LA City Council presented us with awards. The police chief had a special lunch for us to thank us, because what I was trying to do, I wasn't pro-police or pro-SLA. I was trying to do the story of what was happening. So when police did good stuff, which they did, they actually tried to rescue people. They actually were helping people. When they were trying to do stuff, I was reporting it. And, you know, and by the same token, when the SLA was willing to kill anybody who was moving, I was reporting that too. They didn't care who they killed. They didn't care if they killed a child or a woman or an elder. And the houses, we went back the next day, the bullet holes in the houses that had been shot up, not by the police, but by the SLA, you wouldn't believe the damage that was done by those machine guns. And the houses that we were near had bullet holes in them. People were coming out to me, and they had hands full of the bullets that they dug out of their walls that the SLA had fired. So there wasn't anybody in that neighborhood that was pro-SLA, and it was all black after that shootout. And they were, in fact, I was interviewing them toward the end. Stephen Weed, who was the fiance of Patty Hearst, happened to be in Southern California the day of the shootout. He shows up at the police barricade where I'm interviewing people, you know, and he acted like he wanted me to interview him. And I'm thinking, and he's one white guy in a sea of black faces, and I'm interviewing all the people who are affected. I'm interviewing the black people who are affected by the shootout, you know, who are telling me their stories. And I don't care that Stephen Weed is the fiance of Patty Hearst, so I don't interview him. In a way, I kind of regret, because years later, CNN does a whole special on us, a 6-part miniseries, documentary series on the whole Patty Hearst story, called The Radical Story of Patty Hearst. It aired on CNN last year. I'm in episode 3. They do a whole chunk on our coverage of the SLA shootout, because you mentioned that it changed the technology. What happened was, we had the only camera like it on the West Coast. It was experimental. There's one other camera like it in the Midwest, in the whole nation, experimental. So CBS was ahead of the curve, right? When all the news directors who used our coverage, because it was shared all around the world, saw what that camera was capable of, what this mini cam could do in terms of live coverage, they all wanted one of those in their newsroom. So that was the proof of the concept, was that broadcast literally helped change the face of broadcasting, because within a year of that broadcast, they had dozens of stations that had a version of that camera, which was now in production, and it wasn't just tied to a cable. They had a battery pack to power it, and they kept refining it. Ikegami had a version, other people had a version. They started off like $40,000 each. Only newsrooms could afford them. You could only have like 1 or 2 in a newsroom. But basically, within 5 years, just about every news station had those kind of cameras, to the point where, fast forward to 1980, I've come home from my acting news career in 1980. I host a town hall for Channel 2 as an audition. The news director of Channel 6 sees me do the audition of the town hall show on Channel 2, and the very next day says, "We want you in our newsroom. You belong with CBS like you did in LA. Come over to KOIN." So the next day, I report to KOIN as a reporter, because I've decided by then in 1980 to come home. I'd had enough of LA. And that's the week that Mount St. Helens has its first eruption in 123 years. And so I determined that I'm going to be on that story. And I've just been hired. So I'm the newbie. But what I end up doing, I get involved in the story and I help out. I'm not really on camera a lot. It's my first week on the job there, but I'm doing some stuff. They have their star reporters out doing stuff with the volcano, but I volunteer because we don't know what's going to happen. There's a steam eruption in March of 1980, a steam eruption that Mike Beard is in a helicopter and he reports on the radio for I think it was KGW, and he sees it and it becomes, it's a real eruption. Nobody expects it to happen. And so I go to the Forest Service in Vancouver that weekend as a volunteer and just say, I'm going to sleep here all weekend in case the mountain keeps acting up, and we'll be able to get firsthand information from the Forest Service about this volcano. So I camp out the whole weekend and feed some stories and stuff from there. And that Monday, the news director, Norm Gunning, and the assignment manager, Norm Gunning, assigns me to the best video electronic news gathering team, with the live camera at the station, Carol Thomas and Bruce Collins. And we become the team that basically covers the volcano. Other reporters do too, but we basically end up doing more than anybody. We actually camp out up there for a whole week. We create a thing called Mount St. Helens Updates, which I do inaugurate from the site for the first time. Many reports all day long, feeding the noon news, feeding the 5 o'clock news, the 6 o'clock news, feeding the 11 o'clock news, camping out, helicopter flights over the volcano with geologists, live interviews with the camera, learning all of the roads, the Weyerhaeuser timber private roads back into the area. Bruce is learning how to navigate all these so we can get shots of the volcano. So we basically become the go-to crew for the volcano in March, April, May. May 17th, I go in with the cabin owners to get stuff out of their cabins at Spirit Lake because the mountain's been quiet for a while. May 17th. We get that story. I bring it back. We do the story of the cabin owners. I also do a story on the air on Channel 6 about what the geologists think might happen. They're worried that there's been a bulge growing in the north flank of the volcano, a bulge that's been growing. They're worried that the bulge is going to destabilize the slope and that it's going to cause an avalanche that will go into Spirit Lake and create a tsunami flood down Toutle River Valley and the Toutle River and maybe damage some homes. That's what their big fear is. They don't think there's going to be a big blast yet. They think that, you know, the avalanche is their problem. On May 18th, the avalanche occurs, and it's like taking the cork off of a champagne bottle. The pressure is relieved, you know, in the volcano, which has been expanding, and there's a blast. But instead of going out the top, like we all thought was going to happen, it's a lateral blast. It goes out this way, and it mows down everything and anybody in its sight for miles, including Dave Johnston, who we've interviewed like a week before at his site near the volcano. And he's the guy who dies, and he says, Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it, because the blast cloud is coming his way at 500 miles an hour, and he doesn't even have time to, I mean, it's basically, it's good, he's gone. And basically this blast just, and then it creates these horrendous floods, not just one flood, but all day long, there's flood after flood after flood as more of the mountain disintegrates into the lake, and the lake fills up with logs from the trees that are blown down. And that's when Bruce and Carol and I'm working that day. It's a Sunday, May 18th. I'm supposed to work that day. So I'm on my way to the station when the big one blows. I hear it on ABC radio. I'm listening to the radio and they say, we think this is the big one. And I get to the station and they say, Bill, you got a choice. You can fly into the helicopter, or Bruce and Carol, the team I've been working with for like weeks, they're on their way in, and we're going to send them up with a minicam, and you can go in with them and see how far in you can get, you know. And I said, I'm going in with Bruce and Carol. They were my team. I mean, we've been working together for weeks. I mean, we've done all kinds of stories. And so I go in with them, and we get in there to the town of Toutle, and there's flooding all over the place. And some of the roads that we usually use are washed out, but Bruce knows some of the private roads from Weyerhaeuser. So we're working our way in deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the trauma zone. We find places where the water the flood has come 40 feet high. We can see the marks on the trees where the flood has come down from the mountain. We're getting closer to the mountain in the flood zone, right? And along the way, we're interviewing people. We're doing little stories. We're on a bridge over the Toutle River, where the sheriff is telling people, get off the bridge, another flow's coming, get off the bridge. And all the people on the bridge go back toward the town of Toutle, and we go toward the volcano. You know, it's like with the SLA shootout, we ran toward the bullets to get the story. Well, Bruce and Carol and I are running toward the volcano to get as deep in as we can. And finally, we're on the Spirit Lake Highway, just at a point where we've actually gone before to get up to high ground where we could broadcast a live picture all the way into Portland. And that was one of the places that because we've been getting tape along the way too, you know, tape things of the different things that were happening and interviews. We couldn't feed that into Portland because we were in low ground. Does that make sense? We had to be at high ground to feed the microwave signal in. So we were compiling all this stuff all day long. And I did a phone interview at one point, you know, from one of the places. And then just as we get to this point where we can go up to high ground, Carol says, Bruce, what's a freight train load of logs doing coming down the Toutle River? And Bruce looks at the Toutle and she says, that ain't no freight train of logs. That is the Toutle River. And the logs were coming right down on us. It was like a 20-foot high tsunami just coming right down where we were. And Bruce, who's driving, we saw our little side road, you know, that we'd used before. Thank God. I mean, we got there right at that moment. I mean, there wasn't any other place for us to turn off. You know, if you understand this, we're on the Spirit Lake Highway. There's only one place where it's safe for us to turn to get to higher ground. And we get to that one place at the moment that these logs are coming down to wash us away. And Bruce floors it. And behind us, the tsunami washes out the road that we were just on. Goodness. That's how high it is. And we go to the top, and now we've got, and then I find, we go down, this is logging camp on the South Fork of the Toutle River that's been almost destroyed by the flooding. And we find a guy who had been there, and we bring him up on our hill, and I interview him live on the 5 o'clock news with the volcano still going in the background. We're the only live picture from the northwest side of the volcano. Everybody else is south, because the north side is the bad side. You know, only by then the wind was blowing to the east. And so the smoke was going that way towards Spokane, and we were northwest of it. So we were safe. But if the winds had changed, we would have been sucking all those fumes, because it was poison gas that was coming out, you know. So, but we interviewed the guy, we got pictures of the spouting volcano. And then Carol went back down into the logging camp. She says, I got to get some more shots, you know, of the destroyed, you know, the railroad cars were on their side, you know, the tracks were mangled, you know, all this stuff. Turns out that nobody was killed in the logging camp because it was a Sunday and only the night watchman was there. That was the guy that we interviewed. So we, you know, he was okay. He got out, he heard it. He heard the flood coming. So he ran for high ground. And that's how we got our interview. Anyway, we went down there, and Carol's shooting, and she's wading into like knee-deep mud to get her shots. I mean, you know, just, it's awful. And she's getting all this destruction and devastation. And all of a sudden, this helicopter comes in and lands and starts waving at us. And we can't figure out what's wrong. And then we realize we're stranded. They've sent the helicopter in to rescue us. You know, somebody figured it when we were on live on the air and said the road behind us was gone. We realized that we were trapped. We figured we were going to have to sleep in the van that night. We didn't have any food or anything. We didn't know, you know, but we just figured we would just be there. And they sent an Air Force Reserve helicopter rescue unit in to get us, and in one of those big helicopters. And so they're waving at us, and Carol's shaking her head. She says, I'm not done yet. I'm not done yet. She's getting her shots. Finally, they're getting pissed at us, you know, and so they wave at us. And so we finally run over to where they are, and they fly us away. And we leave the van parked on high ground. You know, that spot that we broadcast from was on high ground in order to get the microwave signal into Portland. So it was safe from the flooding. It was you know, turns out that it sat there for weeks until they rebuilt the road in to drive it out. So, you know, so that van, we saved the van, but it sat there for literally weeks of not being used. I even had a jacket in that van that had some of my residual checks from acting in it that I was going to go to the bank with. I had stuff in my pocket, but I left it all in the van. Anyway, we got it all out later. They flew us out, and they flew me to where Mike Donahue was broadcasting at the south side. But Carol and Bruce stayed with the rescue team with the camera, and they rescued Dave Crockett, who was the Seattle cameraman who was on the Tonight Show a few days later, because he had been up there filming it with his camera when the cloud had enveloped him from the explosion, and he thought he was going to die. and he sees this little patch of blue up ahead as he's surrounded by this cloud, and he's choking, and he's talking into the camera, thinking he's going to die, and these are his last words, and he keeps walking, and he manages to walk far enough out where the helicopter that Carol and Bruce are on can spot him, and they go down and they rescue Dave Crockett, and they give him oxygen, and Carol's got the shots of him being administered oxygen, and they take him to the hospital, and he recovers, and he's on the Tonight Show days later with Johnny Carson talking about, you know, his experience at Mount St. Helens, the day of the big one, the day of May 18th. But Carol and Bruce have these original shots of him actually being rescued, which we used later in our coverage, you know. But, and then the next day, I talked my team, Carol and Bruce, onto the National Guard rescue helicopter. And we went out looking for more survivors. And we also went up the Toutle River Valley past the point where we had to turn off, you know, right to the edge of Spirit Lake. And we got the first shots from the air of all the down timber, you know, the trees laid like matchsticks along the slopes that had been blown down by the explosion, and all the muck and the mud and the steam and the vapors rising. It looked like an otherworldly planet. And we got all those shots, and I did a really, really good report that I did, and we sent it back to Portland, and they edited around my report, and it was our lead story on Channel 6, but they also fed our video to CBS News, and Walter Cronkite had our video as the lead story on the CBS News of the downed trees and all the devastation from the volcano that we shot from the air. We actually got to the edge of Spirit Lake where the sulfur was so strong, the sulfur smell, that the pilot said, "I don't want to breathe this stuff anymore. Let's turn around." And we actually helped the guy get back to his home. We picked him up and got him to his home so he could check on his belongings. And he rescued his dog that he'd had to leave behind. So we had a nice human, heartwarming story of him coming out of his house, carrying his poor little doggie, who had to hunker down all night long while the floods raged around him. And he was okay, and they got him, and they flew him away in the helicopter with the guy, and we interviewed the guy. So from then on, we were like golden. I mean, we won awards for that coverage too. And we ended up doing a documentary, a half-hour documentary called Eruption St. Helens Explodes that I narrated, that went out nationwide. It aired in the top markets nationwide, and also was sold for a while by Channel 6. And we won a national award for it out of San Francisco for best documentary. So, you know, so I did cover, you were talking about me covering the Patty Hearst story. Was a huge story, even bigger than Watergate at that time. I actually covered all this Mount St. Helens stuff with other reporters. I mean, it wasn't just me, but I was one of the major reporters. In fact, when they did a whole feature on it for the award that they sent, they used a lot of the stuff that Carol and Bruce and I had done. And several of my reports were in their featured coverage, you know, from the time. And the other big story I covered after the SLA, Nixon resigned in August, and I covered his return to California after he resigned the presidency as a private citizen live with my minicam crew down in LA. And that report ended up going out over CBS as well. So I did like the SLA, the Nixon resignation story, and the Mount St. Helens story, all within a few years of each other, you know, as a reporter. So those were some of my big stories that I covered, you know, as a reporter, but I did a lot of other stories too. San Francisco hired me back to Major Market News, and I ended up doing radio and TV in San Francisco, but I didn't like San Francisco. A lot of people say, "You didn't like San Francisco?" No, I didn't, not like Portland. So I came home to Portland again, and that's when Judy and I ended up getting married, and you know, and never looked back. I've done a lot of public service in between. Some of the news jobs I took, I ended up going through hard times with recessions where you get laid off. And so I was laid off of a couple of jobs here in Portland, but in between I would do things for nonprofits like Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon. I worked with them, and Oregon Partnership, the anti-drug people, worked with them. Ran a whole anti-meth campaign, media campaign over 2 years while I was there for the governor. And we actually helped stamp out meth labs in Oregon with the campaign. We got all the legislation passed at the state level that we needed, Republicans, Democrats banding together to do the legislation needed to get rid of meth labs, and we did it. And I helped arouse the public through my media campaign to really put pressure on the legislators to pass these laws. And it was a 2-year campaign, and we were successful. And when they signed the bills into law, when the governor signed the bills, they did it in our office, and I was given one of the pins. That's a good place to leave, because it's like, I think that's a good place to stop. I encourage people to aim high, especially now. There are so many opportunities if you just look for them and don't, and find your way. And like I said, there was a time in LA where I stopped liking news per se, but when I did news in Portland, I began liking it again. And I had a pretty good career.